Hi, just going to give you a quick video on the Maybox project. So I know there's been a few questions, so we've just taken a few minutes to film a little bit of a demonstration. Please excuse the state of the shop, we're so busy, but we're going to quickly take you through the step by step. Okay, so your pattern pieces are placed on the fabric and your fabric is going to be cut on the fold. So you're going to lay your pattern piece on the fold of the fabric, cut it out, and you're going to end up with your pattern piece like so. So you've got your two pieces that you've chosen for your bag. Now to make French seams, we sew the pieces together, wrong sides together. So I've placed the wrong side of one side on top of the wrong side of the other side of the bag. And I have pinned, we're going to start by sewing around the edge of the sides and the bottom of the bag. We're not going to sew the handles yet. Okay, so I have placed some pins and I'm going to be sewing close to the raw edge. So you've got the protruding seam here, and I'm going to be trying to get my needle running halfway along this protruding seam. Okay. Okay, so make sure your fabric is a little bit pushed along from the needle so that the machine doesn't eat your fabric. And we're going to do a couple of stitches. Don't forget your back stitch. Okay, so we finished the row of stitching. So I've sewn really close to the edge. Oh, I think I've caught that yet. All the way around. Now what I'm going to do is on the curves, just so that when we turn it, it's nice and smooth, just make a few snips into the seam allowance, being careful not to snip the stitches. Okay, so you're just going to do a few snips all the way around. If you need to trim the seam allowance a little bit, then, oh god, you probably need a sharper pair of scissors. Then you can trim the seam allowance. Okay, this is where the French seams come into place. We're going to turn the bag inside out. And we're going to give it a good press. Right, so I'm going to go and press this with the iron. Hi, so we've pressed our bag, and you can see we've just got a little lip protruding there. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to sew this seam all the way around, catching the seam that we've just made within it, okay? Okay, so I'm going to start just here. Be really careful around those corners. Okay, so we've now sewn all the way around. So really what makes this shopper such a strong bag is the double row of stitching. So French seam is, well, I'll turn it around and show you. So we've now got, you can see this is the inside of your bag. It's really nice and neat, no raw edges are to be seen. And we've got a few threads poking out that we can trim off. Bag that's got a really nice double stitched seam. I'll tell you why I've got these threads. I didn't have a very sharp pair of scissors with me, so if before you do your French seam and you trim your seam allowance down as much as you can and snip these off, you won't get this, but I'm going to have to go around and snip these off. That's me rushing, so it's a what not to do. Okay, so you probably, if you haven't experienced French seams before, if you're watching the Sewing Bee when they were doing the underwear week, French seams are used quite a lot in underwear because it makes the seam lie flat against the body. It's less bulk. They work really well with fine materials, but for this, for a shopper, it creates a really sturdy seam because we've got double stitching. Right, so the next thing I'm going to do is talk you through the bias binding. This is what makes this project so great, is that you're learning a couple of things really. You're learning about French seams, but also applying bias binding. So if we grab the bits of bias binding, we'll come back and do the handles. Okay, I'm going to show you now applying the bias binding to the handles. You've got your length of bias binding. Don't cut it in half. Don't worry if you have done, but we can just cut it as we go. Bias binding, you can make your own bias binding by cutting on the 45-degree angle, so basically you're cutting across the bias of your fabric, and all it means is that you're cutting across the bias, which means you've got a bit of stretch in it. So if you go across the straight grain, it's pretty much rigid, but across the bias it gives you movement. Bias binding's been made out of tape, so this is like bias binding tape. It comes pre-made, pre-folded, and it's because it's cut on the bias, it means you've got movement. You can get around curves. It's great for sleeves, edging bags, but it means you can ease it, so it's got manoeuvrability to it. You can it's got a bit of give, and you can sort of ease it into your projects. Okay, so I've just started pinning. I've folded, just show you what I've done here. So you're going to go to the end of the strap, the seam. I've folded the edge in, so we've got a nice neat edge. And I've opened it up. The instructions say to press it open. It's up to you. I haven't. I've just opened it up, and you're going to be aligning the raw edges of your bias binding. You can see I can ease, all of that eases in quite nicely. And I'm going to pin. So I've got the edge turned under, and I'm just starting to ease that bias binding. I'm pinning it in place so that when I sew, it's more or less in place. I might, as the pins, well, as I go along with the sewing machine, I might just remove the bias binding depending on how it moves. But for now, this will just help me a bit. Right, so nearly there. Right. Okay, so I've nearly got to the end. Right, so I've got about that much left. Just going to snip it here. Okay, I'm just folding in that end again. You can see I've got to the seam. So I'm going to fold in the edge of the bias binding and pin it in place. Okay, so we're going to sew along that first folded edge. So we'll start where we ended. Take that pin out, and you're just going to make sure your needle is placed. You can see it's just on the first fold of the bias binding. Do a couple of stitches, do your back stitch. And we're going to sew all the way around the edge. Ooh. Making sure the raw edges are aligned all the way around. So I'm just going around a corner. So just make sure that's eased in nicely. Remember, you can lift the foot when the needle's in the down position. You can lift the foot and gently, if you want, just turn your fabric whilst it's sort of pivoting on the needle. And it helps you get round a corner. I'm just going to check that my bias. Can you see I'm already starting to get a bit of bunch up here? So it's just, it does take a little bit of moving. These are not technical words. So I'm just pivoting around that corner a little bit. It's a curve of the bag handle. It can be fiddly, but with enough pins and patience, you're going to get round those curves. Nearly there. Perfect. There we go, we've just got to the end. Okay, right, so we've just sewn the first bit of bias binding all the way around the curve. Now what we're going to do, we're going to fold this bias binding over on itself. So make sure that end is folded under, and then this then folds over and it covers the entire raw edge. Okay, you can give this a press if you like. I'm going to just quickly pin it, and then I'm going to do that now, and then I'm going to come back to you and show you how we complete the seam of the bias binding. Just pin that in place. We folded the bias binding back over on itself, so all the way along the top of that handle. Now what we're going to do, we're going to do a row of top stitching. You might want to make sure you've got the correct colour thread. I'm going to stick with my thread for now. We're going to sew along the edge here. If you can stitch in the ditch, then please do. If you've pressed it, it might be easier to do so. But by running a row of top stitching, you're going to be sewing and catching underneath. So that should have gone over just enough to catch underneath that row of top stitching. Okay, that looks about right to me. So moment of truth. All right, I think that's in place. Nearly there. Ooh. Right, so here we have it. You can see if you used matching thread, but you can see a bit better on this demonstration. I've sewn all the way around, and on the back you can see the bias binding's been caught. So you've got a lovely, lovely neat row of bias binding on the edge of your bag handle. Okay, I'm going to go away and do the other side, and then I'll come back and show you the inner handle. Okay, I found both of the straps now. I'm going to show you how to do this inner section. It's quite a similar process, just a little bit tighter. we're going to be putting the raw edges together. We don't need to fold over the edge because we're going to overlap in a moment. So again, we're going to be pinning. We've got quite a tight bend here, but remember what I said about bias binding moving. It's cut on the bias, so it will stretch. Can you see what I'm doing? I'm just sort of easing the bias binding round. When you use your bias binding, give it a good stretch. It does move and you get more out of it that way. So you can see I'm just easing the bias binding into the edges. So it was a tight corner. I was able to get around it by just using my fingers to ease the bias binding into the edges of those corners. Right, so I'm going to get all the way around. I don't know if you've noticed how I pin, but this, by putting the pins perpendicular to the edge, it stops a lot of movement of the two fabrics, and it also means when you're sewing you can whip those pins out quickly, so you're less likely to break your needle on a pin. Okay, there we go. Right, so I've met the raw edge. Okay, I've got quite a bit left over there, so I'm just going to trim with my blunt scissors. Oh no, they're all right. I'm going to fold over, overlap that there, fold that under and pin it. Okay, so there we go, we've pinned all the way round. Let's get sewing. This is our last bit of sewing, our last piece of bias binding. We're nearly ready. So I'm going to start where all the pins are, take one out. Again, we're going to be lining up our needle with the first fold of your bias. Little back stitch, and I'm going to whip those pins out because I've pinned them perpendicular. Ooh. You still with me, everyone? I'd understand if you fast forward this bit. I'm nearly there, nearly there. Okay, here we go. Nearly got all the way around. Right. So we've just sewn all the way around that inner part of the handle, and we're going to fold the bias binding back on itself like we did earlier. Okay, so there we go. Fold that. You see, we've completely covered that raw edge. You've got your folded edge there. We're going to bend it over and place a pin. And we're going to do that all the way around like we did earlier. I'm just going to put a couple of pins in just to speed this demonstration up. Remember, your bias tape will fold over nicely. Okay, let's get going. So as we did before, we're going to sew along as close to that seam there as you can. If you can sew in the ditch, which is basically that ditch of stitching there, and you will catch the bias tape on the back. Gets really fiddly. What you can do, I mean, if you're finding there's not enough space, you can take these drawers out and it gives you a bit more manoeuvrability. It's great when you're doing things like armpits and you want to get round and you need a little bit more space by taking that drawer out. There you go. Right. Oops, get that pin out. You see how quick it is to take those pins out when you pin them that way. There we go. There we have it. You just need to give it a press so it lays flat. But once you've given it a press, you have got, let me just straighten it out, your little shopper. I'm going to keep mine folded up in my handbag, perfect for little trips into the shop. You can use them for whatever you fancy, but really handy, great little gifts. Maybe now's the time to start making Christmas presents, stocking fillers for friends and family. But it all just needs a little press and then you're good to go. I hope that's helped. Any questions, please give me a shout. And also, if you like these videos, I'm probably going to do one now every month. Probably when it's less hot and sweaty, my shop's a little bit tidier, but we'll be with you. I'm going to support you on these projects and hopefully you're going to be learning lots from them. Thanks very much. Bye.